In Ohio, Curtis gazes up at the vast clouds overhead while standing in the rain, puzzled because it seems like motor oil instead of water. But it's just a dream. The weather is actually delightful. Later, Curtis has breakfast with his wife, Samantha, and their deaf daughter, Hannah, before heading to work. Curtis works for a construction company, while Samantha, besides taking care of Hannah, sews items to sell at the local fair on Saturdays. That afternoon, Samantha is at home with friends who brought their kids for a playdate. One of them notices Hannah holding a dangerous piece of wood with nails, prompting Samantha to rush outside to stop her, as yelling warnings doesn't work. Moments later, heavy rain forces the construction workers to call it a day, and they gather for drinks at the bar. Back home, Samantha teaches Hannah the sign for storm as they watch the rain through the window. After leaving the bar, Curtis drops off his co-worker and close friend Duarte at home. They chat briefly, and Duarte remarks on Curtis having a wonderful life, though Curtis confesses it's not always as perfect as it seems. Their talk is cut short when Duarte's wife insists he come inside. Returning home, Curtis checks on Hannah while Samantha mentions the girl's difficulty in connecting with other children. The next day, Curtis cleans up the yard to prevent Hannah from finding more dangerous objects. Suddenly, a heavy storm rolls in, and lightning strikes the ground, causing Curtis's dog Red to bark wildly. As Curtis reaches for Hannah's hand, the dog breaks loose from its chain and attacks Curtis, biting his arm viciously. However, Curtis wakes up in his room. He notices Hannah playing with Red and worries, quickly moving her away from the dog. When Samantha asks what's wrong, Curtis snaps and leaves without touching his breakfast. Later at work, Curtis remains distracted and can't stop staring at his arm during a meeting, convinced he still feels pain. Boss Jim is furious about the rain delay and insists they make up for lost time today. On the way to the site, Curtis asks Duarte to help gather extra supplies first. During a break, Curtis steps outside and spots a swarm of blackbirds in the sky, flying in peculiar patterns. He mentions it to Duarte, who didn't see anything unusual. Because they had to put in extra hours to catch up, Curtis ends up running late for Hannah's parent-teacher conference at school. He arrives disheveled and muddy since he didn't have time to shower. They learn more essential sign language for their kids, something Curtis needs to practice more since he doesn't spend as much time with Hannah as Samantha does. Sometime later, it starts raining again, and Curtis hurries to get into the car with his daughter. The rain makes visibility difficult, causing them to crash. Curtis has a bleeding head, but Hannah is unharmed. Suddenly, men appear outside the car and begin smashing the windows. One man holds Curtis down while another kidnaps Hannah. Curtis wakes up screaming, realizing it was just a nightmare. Samantha notices and worries, but Curtis assures her it's just a cold and insists she go to the fair with Hannah. While Samantha is busy selling her goods and haggling with customers over prices at the fair, Curtis unpacks the extra supplies from work and constructs a fence around the doghouse. He then locks Red inside, feeling sorry for the dog. His next task should be cleaning up the trash, but he gets distracted by a door leading to a storm shelter. Curtis rummages through an old jar to find the key, finally managing to open the door. He goes downstairs to ponder a new idea. Later that evening, Samantha adds the money she made at the fair to their vacation savings. She asks Curtis why Red is now kept outside, but he gives a vague reply. Samantha persists, but Curtis ignores her, focusing on the news report about a gas leak affecting a nearby family, which fuels his paranoia. The following day, Curtis discovers Hannah gazing at the storm through the window. As he approaches, he's startled to see a man standing outside watching them. Curtis swiftly scoops up Hannah and rushes to hide as the man attempts to open the door. Suddenly, the entire building trembles, and objects in the living room start levitating. Curtis struggles to breathe amid the chaos. Then everything crashes down, and Curtis wakes up in a cold sweat from yet another nightmare. When Samantha enters, Curtis quickly hides his accident under the blankets. He asks for the doctor's number, and Samantha tries to check on him, concerned. However, Curtis snaps at her, preventing her from seeing the wet sheets. He promptly apologizes, blaming his outburst on feeling unwell, but insists she go to church while he looks after Hannah. Once Samantha leaves, Curtis changes the sheets and cleans up the evidence. Later, he takes Hannah to the library, where he keeps her busy with a children's book while he researches mental illness. On their way home, they stop at the grocery store to stock up on canned foods. Their tardiness causes them to miss lunch with Hannah's family, who criticize Curtis for skipping church. In the afternoon, Curtis starts cleaning the storm shelter and organizes the canned food for emergencies. He spends time there reading library books. Sometime later, Curtis finally sees a doctor and explains he's had trouble sleeping for 4 days. Initially, the doctor doesn't think it's serious, so Curtis opens up about his nightmares, admitting to bedwetting and persistent pain from the dog bite. The doctor agrees to prescribe medication for a few days and advises Curtis to see a psychiatrist in Columbus. Meanwhile, Samantha visits the insurance agency to inquire about the surgery to restore Hannah's hearing. Fortunately, her request is approved and all expenses will be covered due to the excellent policy provided by Curtis's job. At the same time, Curtis heads to the pharmacy to pick up his medicine and is pleasantly surprised by how little he has to pay, thanks to his insurance. That night, the family enjoys a wonderful dinner together, celebrating the good news. However, Curtis keeps quiet about his medication. While getting ready for bed, Samantha begins planning a vacation now that financial worries are lifted. In private, Curtis takes his medicine in the bathroom. The next morning, he wakes up feeling refreshed, and Samantha notices he looks healthier too. However, at work, Curtis discusses with Duarte about the amount of food needed for a shelter. Suddenly, he hears thunder in the otherwise clear sky. He asks Duarte, who confirms he didn't hear anything either. Overwhelmed with panic, Curtis rushes to a nearby bin and vomits. Struggling through a panic attack, he leaves work and finds it difficult to breathe while driving. He pulls over to collect himself and regain control. Once calm, Curtis spots a store selling containers and buys one to expand the shelter. Shortly after, he visits his mother, who behaves strangely due to her heavy medication. It emerges that she developed paranoid schizophrenia around Curtis's current age. Concerned about his own mental health, Curtis tries to ask her about that period, but she doesn't remember much. Later, Curtis calls his doctor to explain he can't make it to Columbus to see a psychiatrist, requesting an alternative. That night, he calculates the cost of transforming the shelter into a complete bunker. The next morning, he goes to the bank and secures a home improvement loan without informing his wife, disregarding his agent's warnings. Later at work, Curtis turns to Duarte for assistance, expressing his desire to borrow some equipment from the job site to build his bunker. Despite the rule violations involved, Duarte agrees to help. A concerned Duarte asks Curtis if everything is all right, and Curtis assures him that he's fine. After work, he visits a local counselor and discards all his hypotheses from his earlier research. The counselor clarifies that she cannot diagnose or prescribe medication, but she offers to talk and guide him through his crisis. Curtis begins by discussing his mother, who abandoned the family when he was young, leaving his father to raise him and his brother. Eventually, she was found eating from a dumpster and placed in a state hospital. He also opens up about his recurring dreams. In the evening, the family attends another school meeting. On their way home, Curtis pulls over as he notices numerous lightning strikes in the sky. Despite his concerns, his family remains asleep, and other drivers show no reaction, intensifying his worries about his mental state. On Saturday, while Samantha and Hannah enjoy the fair, Curtis and Duarte begin working on the shelter. When Samantha returns and sees their progress, she becomes upset, leading to an argument. Samantha grows even more frustrated upon learning about Curtis taking out a loan and questions his recent unusual decisions, such as locking up Red. Curtis offers no explanation and leaves to check on Hannah, leaving Samantha in distress. That night, Curtis takes more medication than prescribed. After a restless night, Samantha wakes up to find Curtis having a seizure and bleeding beside her. She calls an ambulance, despite Curtis insisting it's unnecessary. After the paramedics leave, Curtis finally opens up to Samantha. He promises he's been regularly seeing a counselor because he's determined not to abandon his family, like his mother did. The following day, Curtis and Samantha take Hannah to the hospital for a checkup, and the doctors schedule her surgery for 6 weeks from now. At work, Curtis meets with his boss and requests to have Duarte reassigned from his crew, reluctant to give orders to his close friend. Jim finds this request unusual, but agrees, noting Curtis's recent absences. After work, Curtis goes to a store to purchase gas masks, which turn out to be costly. Meanwhile, Duarte's wife shares rumors about Curtis's behavior with Samantha, who defends their situation vehemently. Later on, Curtis is busy working on the shelter when his brother Kyle pays him a visit. Kyle, informed by Samantha about Curtis's odd behavior, expresses concern for Curtis's well-being. Curtis insists he's fine and encourages Kyle to visit their mother, highlighting their strained relationship. Before Kyle departs, Curtis recalls he had been searching for a dog and asks Kyle to take Red. During a stormy afternoon, Curtis walks into the kitchen and finds Samantha drenched from the rain. They share a tense moment, and Samantha briefly considers grabbing a knife. However, this turns out to be another vivid dream. At breakfast, Curtis can't shake the unsettling feeling from the nightmare. When Samantha reaches out to touch his hand, he instinctively pulls away. Just then, they notice Jim waiting outside. Curtis hurries to meet him and receives devastating news. Jim has discovered the equipment Curtis borrowed illegally, leading to Curtis being fired with only 2 more weeks of medical insurance. Duarte, who assisted, is given 2 weeks of unpaid administrative leave. When Curtis breaks the news to Samantha, she slaps him in frustration before rushing out of the room with Hannah. Later, Curtis visits his counselor, only to find out she has been replaced by a new therapist. This new therapist suggests starting over, but Curtis can't bear to revisit his past, so he leaves without a word, then resumes working on the shelter. Meanwhile, Samantha continues sewing clothes for neighbors to earn extra money, but it's not sufficient, so she resorts to using their remaining vacation savings. In the evening, Samantha talks to Curtis, who explains that his flinching earlier was due to a dream. He reaches out and grabs her hand to reassure her that he's actively addressing his issues. Samantha announces they're canceling the beach trip and will use Curtis's final paycheck to cover 2 months of bills. She decides to postpone Hannah's surgery and emphasizes the need for both of them to focus on finding jobs. Samantha agrees to work on their relationship under the condition that Curtis sees a psychiatrist. She insists he attend a school dinner over the weekend to address his isolation. On the night of the event, Curtis confronts Duarte, who blames him for losing his job. Curtis attempts to discuss it privately, but Duarte continues to vent about feeling betrayed. The tension escalates, resulting in a physical altercation where Curtis retaliates after being pushed and punched by Duarte. In frustration, Curtis loudly warns about an impending storm and has an emotional breakdown. Samantha intervenes and escorts him home. Sometime later, Curtis spots Hannah in the middle of the road and rushes to her side. Suddenly, a flock of birds appears in the sky, flying erratically towards them. Curtis shields Hannah as the birds swoop past, then they fall lifeless to the ground in a strange pattern. Terrified, Curtis races inside as a real-life siren begins to wail. It's pouring rain outside, prompting Curtis to gather his family and seek refuge in the shelter. He secures the door and ensures they wear oxygen masks as a precaution. Later, they all fall asleep. Curtis and his family are in a deep slumber, waiting for the storm to pass. A few hours later, Curtis wakes up and checks the door, sensing the storm still raging outside. He returns to bed. In the morning, Samantha wakes him, urging him to open the door as the storm has passed. Curtis insists he can still hear it and encourages Samantha to touch the door to feel it herself. Samantha perceives nothing. Anxious, Curtis steps back, hesitant to open the door, offering the key to Samantha. She refuses, believing Curtis must confront his fears himself. Determined to be strong for his family, Curtis gathers his resolve and finally unlocks the door to reveal a beautiful sunny day. The neighbors are outside, cleaning up debris left by the storm. Sometime later, Samantha takes Curtis to see a psychiatrist. The doctor prescribes additional medication immediately and recommends Curtis take a break from the shelter. He advises the family to rest and prepare, as Curtis will need to stay at a specialized facility for recovery. This means they won't see him for a while. The next day, the family is at the beach. Curtis and Hannah build a sandcastle when suddenly Hannah signs storm and points at the sea. Samantha emerges and notices it's raining oil. The entire family observes a large, dark storm approaching in the distance. Curtis turns to Samantha, who nods in agreement, confirming she sees it too.
Thanks for tuning in. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the bell icon, and stay connected with us.